Joining us now, though, is Jose Luis. Jose Luis, how are you?
Very good. Thank you so much for inviting me back here. What a great lineup you have today on today's show.
It's going to be. And so you're heading tomorrow to Honduras. So sketch out for us the background here. So I think maybe we can start in 2009. The current president's, Xiomara Castro's current president's husband is in office at the time and is ousted in a coup. The level of U.S. involvement has been debated, but the U.S. support for that coup is not in dispute. And the U.S. immediately afterwards, once the right wing took over, recognized that government and helped keep in place conditions that kept the narco trafficking right wing government in place for the next couple of terms. But then Castro comes storming back. She seems to be almost as popular at this point as Claudia Sheinbaum. So walk us through what made Castro such a popular figure and what makes this a difficult re-election for the left.
Sure. I think 2009 is a great place to start, precisely because I think everything that has played out over the last few years is a response to that moment. And you're right, the U.S. involvement was important. I think, even Hillary Clinton wrote about it in her memoirs about her involvement in that. And it was a different moment in Latin America. There was a lot of pushback there. And in fact, even the OAS actually played a relatively positive role in actually denouncing that coup. But that coup was consolidated. Ultimately, Mel Zelaya was ousted from power. The left forces that he represented were marginalized, and they were marginalized through a brutal dictatorship, through a lot of violence, through the repression of activists and organizers against labor unions and the rest of it. And I think to fast forward a little bit, we end up having a two-term leadership of a gentleman named Juan Orlando Hernandez. And Juan Orlando Hernandez comes from the National Party, and he presided over a brutally violent dictatorship, winning under disputed conditions there, very much with the support of the United States. But interestingly enough, he was widely believed, and it was eventually proven in U.S. courts, to be directly tied to narco trafficking. But of course, that wasn't an issue for the United States because, as that saying goes in foreign policy circles in Washington, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And so as long as he was doing what the United States was seeking to do in Central America, its priorities there with that region, then they were happy to tolerate his very clear connections until ultimately he left office. Now, in the 2021 elections, we saw the end of the National Party rule, which installed itself after the coup against Manuel Zelaya, with the victory of Xiomara Castro in those elections. And it was a very interesting moment. I happened to be in Honduras for those elections as well. And it was really obvious the moment I arrived in the country that the mood in the country was for change, that they wanted to see an ouster of the traditional parties in Honduras, usually would trade back and forth between the Liberal Party and the National Party. The National Party is probably the most sort of prolific political organization. They have very deep roots in the country, a lot of kind of grassroots structures that allowed them to be able to stay in power for many years. And there was this, breaking up of this previous kind of arrangement in Honduras with the election of Libre. Libre, Libertad y Refundación, is a product of the resistance on the streets in communities against this coup. It is the political party that emerged as a result of the National Front of Resistance. And she presided over a left-wing government that I think actually did achieve a lot of important things, which explains her popularity around reducing poverty. Central American countries experience extreme levels of poverty, and she was able to reduce by 13% the levels of poverty in her country, investments in infrastructure, building hospitals and roads. But I think the important thing here, and probably why we're also seeing a lot of U.S. attention, is for geopolitical reasons. So Xiomara Castro Libre is very much aligned with the left-wing governments of the region. So, Mexico is a very strong ally. In fact, Xiomara Castro was just here in Mexico for a bilateral meeting with Claudia Sheinbaum, but also with Venezuela, with Nicaragua, with Cuba, but also some of sort of the central-left governments as well. It's very much viewed as kind of part of that grouping of progressive countries. And also I think it's important to mention is that her government presided over a pivot away from Taiwan to China and officially recognizing the People's Republic of China and signing cooperation agreements with China there. And so that's why we're seeing a renewed interest in this. And of course, also responds to the fact that we're also in a moment where the United States is very much interested in digging its claws back into the region. And I think that's also why we're seeing this. And in a lot of ways, what happens in the elections, I think, will be a test in terms of how far can the U.S. actually influence things in order to get governments that are friendly. And this upcoming election is very much, it looks to be breaking down between that. So Xiomara Castro can't run for re-election. She's prohibited by the Constitution for seeking re-election. And the candidate for Libre is Rixi Moncada, who represents, I think, sort of the more progressive, the more left-wing aspect of the Libre party. And her main rival is Salvador Nasralla, who's running on behalf of the Liberal Party. And he's the one who's really kind of been trying to drum up as much support as possible, above all from the Florida lobby, or as I call it, the Gusano lobby, which is incredibly powerful and has been very active.
The Rubio lobby. Yeah,
that's right.
So what it reminds, so what we're seeing in the news now are all of these warnings, vague warnings that, oh, look out, election fraud is going to take place. The incumbent government is going to steal the election. Be scared. And it reminds me of, I believe it was 2019 Bolivian election, where the right there for weeks leading into the election claimed that there was going to be election fraud. Then the vote happened. Morales was clearly winning, and they cried foul, and they got other kind of stamps of approval from various kind of allies of the U.S. to say, yes, this does look fraudulent. They pour out into the streets, and they basically overthrow the government. And that coup government lasted only 1 year because it was so unpopular. It did end up leading kind of to the breakup of the left parties over there, and now the right has taken over in Bolivia. But are we seeing that again? Is that what the Honduran right is trying to set the stage for by talking about all of the potential voter fraud going? And what U.S. role do we see here? Because you're hearing a lot of the Libre Party folks say the U.S. is meddling in this. Like, so how?
So you're absolutely right to compare it to Bolivia. In fact, the right tried to do the same thing here in Mexico. And it's really kind of an unfortunate feature of Latin American politics, especially when the leading contenders involve somebody who's left of center, which is that you can't just win by a small margin. You have to win by a really large margin for two reasons. One, to kind of overcome—
too big to rig, as Trump calls it.
Basically, yeah. Oddly enough, he's right on that. In terms of accounting for the irregular activities that do happen in every election that are not usually enough to change the result, but can be, and historically there we have had instances of that, but also to calm the waters, to basically remove all of that doubt. And this election is very tight. It's not like the 2021 election where the winner was overwhelming and it was obvious to everybody, and even if they wanted to cry fraud, no one would believe them. This is going to be a tight race. The polls are very difficult to trust. They're kind of all over the map. I was reviewing them this morning, and they kind of paint a picture of a country divided in three between Libre, liberals, and National Party supporters. But really, it's between Libre and the Liberal Party in Salvador Nasralla versus Rixi Moncada. The National Party obviously does have a lot of strength and will likely have a strong presence in the Congress, but when it comes to the presidential election, it's largely between those two, and it's going to be close. And because it's close, if it's not, say, 5% difference between the first and second place, and of course Honduras only has one round, so they don't necessarily have to secure 50%. It's first past the post. Whoever gets the most votes in this election will become the president. Well, they're going to dispute it, and that's why you're hearing all of this noise now. They're sowing the seeds. They're trying to lay the groundwork for disputing it, even if it's clear that Rixi won, that it's going to be a lot of instability if the victory isn't enough. And so this noise that we're hearing from people like Maria Elvira Salazar and, this hearing that she had from Salvador Nasralla himself, who recently reposted, oddly enough, a video of Venezuelan far-right activist Maria Corina Machado on his social media accounts, to send this idea that it's going to be an election that's under dispute. And on the one hand, try to overturn it, as we saw in Bolivia, to try to create so much instability on the ground that there's no choice but to find another exit to the crisis, or to undermine the government before they even get into office, to kind of weaken them so that they will have a lot of difficulty governing, which is actually a little bit of what we saw in the case of the current president, Xiomara Castro, where we saw her actually really struggling to get any legislation through and the rest of it because of the difficult conditions for governability there. It's setting up to be a quite difficult circumstance. But I think there is where it's important for the international community. That's why I'll be traveling there with a number of other observers. There's thousands of accredited observers who are going to be on the ground reporting on this, to be able to denounce any irregular activities, if there is some, to alert if these irregular activities rise to the level of actually undermining the integrity of the vote. And if there aren't presented, if we can say that the results represent the will of the Honduran people, to be able to defend that, because there's going to be a very determined effort to undermine Rixi Moncada's government if she ends up being the winner.
Is the left in Honduras galvanized and organized enough to defend a victory? If it is a narrow victory, or is it, because sometimes you get a situation where there's a dispirited sense among the cadres and they just kind of just go home.
So certainly
in the face of repression,
the Liberal Party would activate its bases, and it does have considerable support amongst the population. I mean, this was a left-wing government that did deliver results to the population in some regards, but there is tensions between sort of the social movements. For example, many of your viewers and listeners may be familiar with the Garifuna communities on the northern coast of Honduras, which are very autonomous, very well organized. They've obviously had a lot of differences concerning around the lack of progress that the government has been able to do around key issues, like these attempts to build these private cities, for example, the encroachments on their territory.
Like
so there are some tensions there.
Cities. Yeah.
But I do think that if there is a circumstance where we're seeing blatant, direct U.S. interference attempts on Honduran sovereignty, that the social movements also have the clarity that there are things that go beyond their particular differences in a given moment with the government of the day, to defend their institutions, to defend their country. Because I think most people, certainly in Latin America, and I think Honduras is one of the countries where there is probably a heightened understanding of this, is that you don't want to invite the United States in right now. And I think it's really worth reminding people that the United States interference in other countries has been disastrous for many people throughout this region. We're seeing this bombing campaign. We saw this effort to blatantly interfere in the Argentine elections. We saw what happened in Ecuador, although obviously the population there said no to the plans for U.S. bases there. So speaking of U.S. bases, the United States does have an active presence inside of Honduras. It stems from the 80s, from the Cold War era. So, Hondurans are very aware what it would mean for a U.S.-friendly government to come in, especially if they come in, by trying to sow chaos on the streets. And so it'll be really important to see not just what happens on Sunday in the actual vote, but everything following. What will be the mood on the streets in terms of responding to what the actual results are.
Last question for you. What I'm trying to figure out is, what is really driving the U.S. policy here? Because, okay, you can imagine 100 years ago or so, U.S. is a little bit smaller. The world is smaller to the United States. Gunboat diplomacy and, basically imperial control of Central and South America was important to U.S. policy, U.S. identity. It's 2025. Like, why are we bothering with Honduras? Like, no offense to Honduras, but the United States GDP is not going to move much one way or the other, whether or not we allow union organizing and environmental protection and allow for some economic growth and dignity in Honduras. The thinking was 100 years ago, you can't allow for any of that. Got to keep everybody miserable. On the other hand, if we do succeed in installing a right-wing government that makes the conditions of life untenable for people in Honduras, we'll then see a lot more pressure from Hondurans on the southern border, which actually the American right does care about. Like, that's something they don't want. So then you have the Florida lobby, the Gusano lobby, the Rubio types who just have this grudge over decades. I guess I understand emotionally where that comes from. But so from your understanding, like, what is the U.S. doing? Like, why does it even care so much as to be a player in Sunday's Honduran elections?
It's really quite interesting because a lot of their policies ultimately are counterproductive to their own stated policy goals.
Yeah.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, for example, to be attacking Venezuela. And, there's still all these rumors going on about whether there's going to be land strikes. I mean, that's obviously going to produce another new wave of migration. And so, even in the case of Honduras, for a long time, it's no longer the case today, but they were the number one countries of migration because of the brutal government of Juan Orlando Hernandez, which basically was expelling people. And in fact, one of the challenges of this current government, Xiomara Castro, has been all of the people being deported back to Honduras, who many of whom have no roots with the country anymore, or don't have the networks. And so trying to kind of reintegrate them back into society. Some of them don't even speak Spanish. They've lived so many years in the United States. So it's been a real challenge. It's an influx of people that you have to find jobs for, right? And the social safety net isn't as deep or wide as it is in other countries because of its relatively lesser affluence as a result of its economy. So what is actually driving this? Like you said, I think frankly the Gusano lobby plays a really big role. And sometimes in some ways I'm grateful because they often say the quiet part out loud.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard Trump talking about going after the oil in Venezuela. We heard Maria Rivera Salazar say the same exact thing about Venezuela, or oil companies are there, and she happens to be the same person also really kind of pushing on this. And so I do think a lot of it is sort of imperial ambitions. And I think I mentioned on the previous program here that, there seems to be an acknowledgement, even from Marco Rubio, that the battle for global hegemony has been lost. They now have a peer rival in China. And so they feel that the way to reassert their authority, the way that they'll be able to, in a future moment, dispute global hegemony again, because that is their intention, is just a strategic retreat to their traditional spheres of influence in order to build up the capacity to dispute. And so in Honduras, in some ways, is also a bit of, like I said at the beginning, a test case. Can we interfere? Can we actually, meddle as, to the degree that we actually have an influence on the result in order to have more favorable governments there so they can keep doing it? They basically, so it's a test to do it in the future. For example, I've always thought in the case of Venezuela, the whole Guaido experiment of recognizing somebody who had no real claim to the presidency as president, if that had succeeded, that would have been the strategy of U.S. imperialism in the region moving forward, to simply not recognize governments. And again, I think, some of what we're seeing right now, with the sowing of all of this doubt and uncertainty about what the result will actually represent, is to say that, well, we don't consider it a legitimate government. And then you'll probably see some of the same accusations we're seeing now in the case of Maduro and Gustavo Petro in Colombia, which is trying to suggest that they're narco traffickers and that therefore they can be treated as criminals and not as legitimate political actors. That makes it a whole lot easier for them to drive their policy goals forward. And so I think a lot of this is just about seeing how far they can get to do it in the future, to do it in much bigger places like Brazil, places like Mexico, which obviously have much larger economies and much closer relationships with a lot of different actors at the global stage. And, it's easier to try the experiment in a country like Honduras because, it is a smaller country with a less of, smaller population that maybe they feel would be easier to manipulate, to kind of test things out in order to drew it down again in the future, because this is the future of Latin America. It's going to be a question of sovereignty. It's going to be a question of, will Latin America have the political forces and organization to resist this onslaught by the United States that they have made very clear is what's coming?
All right, we'll see. We'll be following this Sunday. Be safe down in Honduras, and we'll look forward to you reporting back, Jose Luis Granados Ceja. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.